Good morning, everyone. My name's Kirsty Lewin. I'm head of the Climate Change Delivery Hub. Thank you very much for attending our first ever webinar from Climate Change in celebration of Scotland's Climate Week. A couple of rules before we get started. Please have your phones off because there are people watching live and they'll be watching the feed, so it would be great if the phones don't go off. And if you're watching live, at the bottom of your screen you should see an email address that will allow you to send in questions, and people will pick up the questions and ask them in the audience from here. We'll not take questions through the presentations as it's easier for people who are watching online to follow the presentation. So Chris Stark is our presenter this morning. Chris is the Director of Energy and Climate Change, and he's going to talk about how we decarbonise an economy, and more specifically Scotland's economy. He'll talk for about 20 minutes and then there'll be plenty of time for questions afterwards. So without further ado, over to Chris.
Thank you, Kirsty. So good morning, everyone, and welcome to a freezing cold Leith. It is very cold. I am going to talk to you, for about 20 minutes, thereabouts, on the topic of decarbonising an economy. And the first question is, how do we decarbonise an economy? And I'm going to spoil it now by saying I don't know. I do know a few things, though, about how we might approach it in Scotland. I also know that it's fiendishly difficult. So that's the kind of exciting thing for me. So a brief word before we begin about all of that. I'm the head of the team here in the Scottish Government that looks at energy and climate issues. And I suppose this is the challenge really for us and the thing that we think most about. I say occasionally in public forums like this that this is one of the best jobs in government, and I really mean it. So we have, I think, one of the most stimulating and interesting challenges to try and address. It's particularly stimulating and interesting because in Scotland we're trying to do it this quicker than most other countries in the world. And we have, of course, a specific set of circumstances here in Scotland to try and tackle. People in the room will have views about how to do all this. One of the interesting things for me is how loaded the topic of climate change is. And I don't mean today that I'm going to stand in front of you and talk about climate science. It's not my intention to talk about that at all. But I think what's interesting is the perception that people have about addressing climate change varies so much. So I'm curious what you think about it. This is a rhetorical question rather than one I'm looking for an answer for. What do you think about when you think about climate change? Do you think about windmills? Do you think about Donald Trump? Those two are connected. Do you think about deindustrialising an economy? Perhaps you think about changes in behaviour. Maybe you think about people wearing sandals, Kirsty. Maybe you think about, it doesn't matter, I don't know what you think about. I think the curious thing is that people have different views about this particular challenge. And I think that's one of the things that makes this so interesting to think about. So today I'm going to talk to you in the next 20 minutes or so about the challenge of addressing climate change and decarbonising. I'm going to start with a bit of history, but I'm going to end up the kind of thread that goes through this. Actually, this is a phrase that Ban Ki-moon uses. I'm going to partly talk about energy. So energy is this kind of thread that runs through this discussion today. Energy is also a particularly interesting thing. I'll come back to why I think it's so interesting later on in the presentation. Ban Ki-moon called it the golden thread that stitched together our environmental obligations, our social obligations, and our economic obligations, and I think that's probably right. So a lot of what I will talk today about is energy related, and that's because I think it's such an important part of this challenge. So let's begin then with a quick slide to show this. So this is about carbon. Carbon is really, really important. It's really important because carbon is really the kind of basis of the modern economy still today. Carbon is also the basis of the kind of modern society that we have. So if you think about Scotland, this is a map of Scotland. This shows you the coal mines that we had in Scotland. And you'll see where they all are. They're right across the middle of this, well, the Central Belt as it's known. The Central Belt is there, and particularly, you know, the conurbations along the way, because of where the carbon deposits were. So our history is defined actually in large part by carbon. Scotland's place in the modern world is, of course, defined by the fact that we found this stuff a bit sooner, that it was pretty easy to find, and we developed an economy around it, and you had the Industrial Revolution, and we started what's now known as globalisation on the basis of that. Most recently, of course, carbon's also been important for the modern economy in Scotland, as although we don't have many coal mines, we have the oil and gas reserves in the North Sea. And we are, as an economy, very rich in carbon. We are very rich as an economy generally, and a great deal of it is to do with, the historical position as you see it there. It's also politically very important. Have you seen this before? This is something that does the rounds occasionally on Twitter, I find, and you can interpret this in many ways. This is just a bit of this is England, of course, England and Wales. And it shows you where the coalfields were and election results, I think not from the last election, but from the one before. And you can read a lot into this. You can read too much into this, actually. But there's a neat correlation, isn't there, between our industrial past and our current political leanings. Question whether that is the case in Scotland or not. And that's a curious thing. But anyway, it's most striking on that map. So this is a real thing. There's an economist in America whose name I can never remember, who said if government doesn't get its energy policy right, it doesn't remain a government for very long. So energy is a hugely important thing historically, carbon, and politically. And the challenge of decarbonising all of that is absolutely gripping, frankly, because it's fundamental. I cannot underestimate quite how difficult it is to do it. So in Scotland, we will have a go at this, and I think we'll be very successful. Other parts of the world will have a different attempt at this. Ultimately, what I know is that we all need to do this. So every country around the world will have this challenge, and it will be different in each area of the world. And I hope we can learn a bit by going first, or amongst the first. Places in the world, rather, first places in the world. So I want to talk to you now about this. So this is the Climate Change Act, and this is a piece of legislation that is extremely interesting. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I think it's particularly interesting when you think about the political history point. So the kind of facts of this legislation are that it was passed in Holyrood in 2009. It's the mirror of a piece of legislation that was passed in Westminster in 2008. It has at its heart a target, which is to reduce emissions from where they stood in 1990, annual emissions, by 80%. So we're going to take 80% of those annual emissions away come 2050, which is enormously difficult. It's an interesting piece of legislation because it was an act of a young parliament. So I think that's one of the most kind of interesting things to say about this, actually, is that the Holyrood Parliament in 2009 was making its way in the world, as young folk do. And I think it was trying to make a statement when it passed this legislation. So it is, in fact, about reducing carbon, of course, and it puts various conditions on us, the executive, the Scottish Government, to lay plans with Parliament to reduce carbon. And that's very important. But I think what's interesting about it is that it will have almost no impact on climate change, directly at least, because the share of the global emissions that we have in Scotland is tiny. I don't quite know what the stat is, but it is absolutely tiny. Our historical share is a bit bigger. So, we've been around producing CO2 for a long time. And we've been exporting people who know a lot about producing CO2 for a very long time too. So I think we can lay claim to quite a large share, historically at least, of global emissions. But in its impact directly, this piece of legislation is very small. So it's a huge impact here in Scotland, but not, of course, in the global challenge of climate change. So I suppose the question is, why bother? And I think what the Parliament was saying when it passed this legislation was that there is much more to this challenge than simply reducing emissions domestically in the Scottish economy. I think what it was saying is that if we do this here firstly we can repair some of the environmental damage that's been done historically by our Scottish exports and Scottish production. But more importantly, I think it's saying this is a way of developing a new set of industries here in Scotland, a new set of skills, a new set of behaviours even, that will be useful to the rest of the world when they come to do the same thing. Now, we are amongst the first countries to really tackle the climate change objectives, the climate change requirement. We're not the only ones, of course. So I think there are, I don't want to stand in front of you today and say that we are a shining beacon. I think I hope we will be amongst the best countries in the world in addressing these things. But I really think that what this is about is tackling it now, sooner perhaps than other countries might, so that we are able to do what we did actually when we first discovered carbon and started that process of the Industrial Revolution many years ago. And I think that's the test for us here as policymakers. What can we make of this beyond simply reducing emissions in the Scottish economy, which is, of course, the thing that the Act requires? That's a 2009 Act. We are at the moment consulting on another piece of legislation, a new climate change bill, which will up that ambition still further and do a few other things in methodology to the way that we account for carbon. And that will take, if it's successful, the current plan is at least that target will move from 80% to 90% come 2050. An even tougher challenge. So that is essentially full decarbonisation. That's the best way to think about it. It leaves just enough room for the kind of emissions that we have from land use without completely dramatic changes to lifestyle from the way that we use our land. But pretty much everything else needs to change. And what a thing to try and do. So I thought I would say a bit about that next. So this is the chart that shows you where we stand. So remember, the Act asks that we take 80% of emissions as they stood in 1990 out of the economy come 2050. And on that chart you see that we have been reducing, until very recently, the annual emissions that we have in Scotland. And we've been doing it pretty effectively. And we should feel really good about that, I think. There's some really good things happening there. But there's also a set of things perhaps that are less good, and it's best to address them here. So what's behind that fall, really, is a story of deindustrialising the Scottish economy. That is the closure of heavy industry. Some of those industries, of course, were industries that Scotland was famous for. That has been a painful process, of course, that has been experienced not just from 1990, but throughout the 1980s and 70s before it. But we've kind of done there, so I'm simplifying here, but we've deindustrialised, so heavy industry, with a few exceptions, has now closed in Scotland. And we've been very good at deindustrialising, or rather decarbonising, the electricity production sector. So we have successfully done a number of remarkable things when we think about where electricity production stood a few years ago, not least the closure of the big coal plants. And the other thing that we've been doing is remember the point about the energy golden thread, we're becoming more energy efficient. And that is mainly a story of technology. So I don't know how many of you here have combi boilers. I imagine most of you do. They're very, very efficient in comparison with the ways in which we used to heat our homes. And there are various other things that have been going on. We're much more energy efficient generally. And all of that is kind of in the bag. So that's what's led to the fall as you see it there. So we have reduced emissions by roughly 40%. What's next? This is where we need to get to. We have an interim target of 42% come 2020. And this target of 80% by 2050. And we hope that that will be raised in ambition over the course of the next legislative calendar to 90%. What's next is not going to be about closing heavy industry. It's not going to be, in the main at least, about closing carbon-based, coal-fired power plants. It's not particularly going to be about, implementing dramatically improved energy-efficient devices in our homes and in our lives. What's next is really hard. So I'm going to say to you now, although we're doing well, we've done the easy bit. So have that in your mind as we talk a bit more about what's coming. What's next is really difficult, and the way in which we will tackle it in Scotland is going to differ, I suspect, from the way that other countries around the world might approach this. And remember what I said at the start, some of this we are doing first, even amongst our friends in the UK. And we're going to have to learn along the way in how we do that. And isn't that exciting? That seems to me that's a great thing to try and do. So this is the challenge. What's interesting about that Act is that it really forces us to think really carefully about where carbon is in the Scottish economy. So the first part of the answer to the question, how do we decarbonise the Scottish economy, is we understand first where the carbon is. And this is what we do. Don't look too much at the chart. Look at the pretty colours instead. But what we've been trying to do since 2009, and since that Act was passed in Holyrood, is get to grips with how we manage carbon. And we've got ourselves just about to the point where we are managing carbon now in the Scottish Government as we would manage a budget. So we're thinking increasingly of carbon as something that is budgeted for, which is essentially what the Act asks for. And just think through what that means. That means that in every year from now to 2050, we have an account, we have a carbon budget that we are able to spend, the best way I can describe it, in the same way as we have a financial budget as a government. And it is our job here in my team to try and plan around that. So to put in place a set of policies, proposals, assumptions about how technologies will develop, about how behaviours will change, that allows us to project into the future how we will allocate that carbon as we would a financial budget. And we've just done the draft, well not just, 6 months ago, more than that, January this year, we produced a draft climate plan, which is the requirement of that Act, and we put it to Parliament. And what we did this year, for the first time ever, was that we built a proper analytical understanding of the whole economy underneath this. So we are further down the route of understanding how we decarbonise an economy than we were, at least, because we have a very good analytical understanding of how carbon is used currently, and we have some understanding of how it might be used in the future. And this is it. So what we do is we take a sectoral approach. So the labels on the right there are the various sectors as we see them of the Scottish economy. Services, the residential sector, that's where we live, our homes. Transport, waste, industry, electricity, agriculture, and my favourite of the sectors, which is LULUCF, which is land use, basically. And we have a good sense of where the carbon is in each of those sectors, and we have a reasonably good sense about how policies and changes will be implemented on those sectors to allow us to meet the overall cap that you saw before. And this is the way we did it. So what we produced in January was a draft plan that looked at the question of how we put together a package of proposals to meet that carbon budget for the future. And we've consulted on it. We've had an enormous amount of scrutiny in Parliament, and when it comes to the start of next year, we'll finalise that. So this is a really interesting point to be having this discussion. And as we've thought about this, more and more, I'm convinced that the primary issues lie in our understanding of energy. So I want to just say a bit, as I come to the last half of this presentation, about that energy challenge. So this is the other chart that I use a lot. This is the kind of story of success in one of those sectors, and that's electricity production. So before I say something about that chart, let's just talk about electricity production in Scotland. As I stand before you today, we have more or less decarbonised electricity production in Scotland. We've done that because we've closed the big coal-fired power plants and a few other things along the way. It's not entirely true to say that we are free from carbon-based production. There are still places where we use it. There's a gas plant in Peterhead. Shetland has its own oil-fired power station, which is in the midst of being replaced at the moment. We still use diesel in places. But the main story behind that really wonderful stat is firstly that we have 2 nuclear power stations that have been there for a long time and are producing carbon-free electricity at the moment. We'll have them for a while longer. And this chart. So this shows you how we are producing renewable electricity in Scotland. And the main thing I suppose to note about that chart is how steep the kind of incline is on it. We have been enjoying a 15-year plus very rapid deployment of renewable power in Scotland, thanks to generous support through bills. So bill payers pay for that in various subsidy regimes that have been implemented through UK government policy. That's planning powers Scottish ministers exercise to allow mostly wind farms to be built in Scotland and mostly onshore. And also, I think this kind of acceptance of all of that from the people of Scotland, that's the kind of thing that sits behind this. I think this is a welcoming place for renewables. You may disagree, but that's the story, I think, of that chart. Briefly, what this chart shows you is a steady increase, more or less, apart from a couple of years, including the last one, in our output as a percentage of how much we need. So each year, the black line on that chart shows you renewable output as a percentage of what is consumed in Scotland. Our target at the moment is to reach 100% of, equivalent of 100% of domestic consumption for electricity from renewables by 2020, so that's only 3 years away. At the moment we're sitting at around 60, and if we have a few big offshore wind farms, that I think we might get close to that target, and I'll be very pleased about that. That is remarkable. So it's about 60 now, 54% in 2016. In 2003, I think it's probably the lowest part of that chart, it was 10%. So in about 10 years, we've seen an enormous increase in renewable investment and renewable deployment in Scotland, and that's wonderful. And I think we can be proud of that. We're going to need to do a lot more of that in the future. But remember what I said earlier, electricity is the easy bit. So we've done that bit, we're going to need to do a lot more of it. One of the reasons why it fell when it did, as a percentage of our gross consumption, is because we are consuming more. So we have more use for electricity, so we need to keep pace with the production as well. And that's great, and it is often, electricity supply is often the thing that is talked about most, both in energy terms and in carbon terms. So, you know, we talk a lot about energy policy, and what that's usually analogous for is electricity production policy. It's just not described in that way. So for the last part of this presentation, I want to encourage you to think about that energy challenge in a different way. So I think in Scotland, although we've done very well on supply of electricity, I think the really exciting thing is to think about how we consume it. So at the moment, our consumption of energy is not the thing that frames most energy policy discussions around the world. It is the thing, I think, in Scotland that we should focus on. And at the moment, that energy consumption is largely still driven by carbon. So let's have a quick trot through the stats in Scotland when you think about that kind of reframed approach to energy. And this is, I'm going to show you over the course of this, the remainder of this presentation, my two favourite charts. This is the first of them. And if you see me speak, you probably heard me talk about this before. This is 1 year of energy consumption in Scotland, so an annualised chart showing you how we consume our energy over a year. And the first thing to note is the 22% of that pie chart electricity. So 22%, that is a fifth of that pie chart, is where most of the discussion of energy policy currently takes place. So mostly we talk about nuclear power plants. There's an enormous discussion still ongoing about whether or indeed if we will build the Hinkley Point C power plant in Somerset. Remember, from now on, that is 20% of the challenge. In Scotland, we have more or less decarbonised that 20% already. The really interesting bits lie outside of that, it seems to me. So the blue bit of that chart is the most striking bit. That's how we heat ourselves. More than half of the energy consumed in Scotland is for the purposes of heat, and 25%, a quarter of it, is transport. So it is my desire that we focus on this chart rather than the one I showed before, important as it is, if we're to tackle the carbon issue, if we're to tackle the behavioural issues, if we're going to develop a new set of industries, if we're all going to get excited about it. I think mostly it lies in this chart. So a bit more on that. So that's how we consume it. Let's look at it by fuel type. So almost half of our energy consumption is petroleum. So that's how we get around. Diesel, petrol. Gas, 32%, so it's a third. That's basically how we heat our homes and our buildings. And then the rest of it there. So coal is almost gone. I think we can expect coal to disappear almost entirely or remain at least at that sort of level for now in perpetuity, unless we have novel ways of capturing the carbon from it. This is the other way to look at this. So look at that blue bit of the chart. This is how we heat ourselves in Scotland. 80% of it is mains gas, so it's carbon. And the rest of it, electricity, only 10%. And the last thing I'll show you, this is household energy use. This is another one I like to think about. It drives home that the long term and the biggest challenge is heat. So 3/4 of household energy use are for the purposes of space heating, that is, spaces that we live in. I heard this a factoid once, that is all waste basically. So that's about heating up a space so it can cool down again. The only question is how quickly it cools down again. So there's that. So remarkably, 3/4 of that household energy use for the purposes of heating something up and then letting it cool down again. 13% further of that is water heating, I could go on, but heating is the kind of is the dramatically most important bit of household energy use. And I want to do something about that chart. So, just a few kind of takes on that when I think about this. I think that this is the kind of challenge when you think about how to decarbonise the economy in the main. And I'm going to show you one more chart now, which is the bit I want you to get excited about. So, in our annualised vision of the world, the obvious challenge here is transport and heat. And this is the best chart that I know. Fairly obvious, right? So this shows you the pattern of use across those three things over 3 years. And in here you'll see, I think, the clues for the strategy overall. So you will have noted, I hope at least, that this year we did a programme for government. So that was just a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago. And in that programme for government, there was one of the most important commitments, I think, for a change in this chart, which I will explain in a second. And that was our commitment to low carbon transport. So remember where we started with this. We've done very well in decarbonising electricity. We've done very great things in decarbonising in industry. Transport is next. So we have laid a commitment both with a package of things on active travel, that's about how we move around. There's also, though, a very important commitment on phasing out petrol and diesel vehicles over the next 15 years. So our ambition is that in 15 years' time, all petrol and diesel vehicles will be gone, well, at least new ones, so we won't be selling them anymore. We'll have an alternative way of powering those vehicles. And in the longer term, alongside that industry, power, transport plan, we need to decarbonise the built environment as well. And the built environment is about making those homes, those buildings in which we work, more energy efficient, making the right investments, and in due course, having an alternative source of heating them as well. So that's how you decarbonise it, I think. This is the chart that says a bit about the challenge. So again, this is 3 years of energy demand. And the thing that you see at the bottom line there, just emphasising the point that it's the least important of the three energy vectors, is electrical demand. And you see this kind of shallow wave over the course of the 3 years, reflecting mainly the fact that it gets darker in the winter. The line above that, which is stepped because we get monthly data, is transport demand. That's transport fuels. And you see it's pretty consistent over the year. And the thing that really dominates it is the gas demand, this kind of peaky chart that shows you big peaks when it's cold, and it falls below the electricity line when it's warm in the winter. And that, in this chart, there's so much that we can talk about. We will need to, I think, most obviously reduce the peaks on that heat chart in due course. So that's about being more energy efficient generally, and more energy efficient in the way that we heat our homes. We are very actively now looking to change the electrical demand line, so we want to produce more electricity through renewables means mainly. But the most interesting chart of all, given the announcement, the bit of this chart given the announcement last week, is the transport chart. And the transport line. I want to kind of leave you with the idea of a very exciting thing here. So I believe if we can convert the transport fleet to something other than petrol and diesel, then we have the answer to where we might store electricity or energy in the future. We best think of these vehicles that we'll be producing as batteries on wheels. So there is a remarkable amount of energy storage at the moment in the gas grid, but also in cars and vehicles that are parked outside our homes and our businesses at the moment. The first stage of this challenge in addressing this, the kind of changing this chart, is in changing the vehicle fleet to something where we can store energy. And if we store energy in a different way, store that renewable energy in a different way, then we can use it in a different way, and that's the exciting thing for us. So if we have batteries storing renewable power, we can also use those batteries. We can consume the electricity when we need it as well. We need a set of smart systems around that to make that work. So when your car is plugged in, yes, it will charge. It may also discharge if power is required to the grid. And in due course, that line that's the heating line is the big challenge for us once we've done all of that. So we need to decarbonise the source of heat in due course and make all of those buildings more energy efficient. I think there is a great chance of us doing that, given the announcements in the last month at least on transport. And next year I hope we'll make a similarly important announcement around the way in which we approach the building stock too. And the reason I say that energy is the golden thread through all this is because energy kind of sits behind the kind of big carbon challenge. It also sits behind the challenge of integrating all of this. So think of a world in the future where we have a well-developed and integrated policy towards the built environment that sees the buildings in our cities and our towns and our villages being more energy efficient, having outside them electric vehicles that are plugged into the grid most of the time, discharging and charging, consuming and storing renewable power. And think of a world where all of that is planned really well regionally and locally. So we have a transport system that's plugged into that properly. We have an energy system where we are generating power and energy in places where we didn't conceive of it 30 years ago. And we have a built environment that's fit for the future. And the key to all of that really is having a well-integrated set of public services and public policies and plans. So I think the answer really in how do you decarbonise an economy is that a national plan for all this relies on having a really well-integrated set of policies and regional plans. And it's my intention at least that we use that kind of golden thread of energy to build those plans over the coming years and to deliver all the things that we know we need to. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Chris, thank you very much. That was a tour de force, and I hope Al Gore was watching.
Yeah, I'm sure he was.
Because I think you explained that incredibly well, and while the graphs can look complicated, with your explanation it was really clear. And as Chris says, I think it's a hugely exciting time to be working on climate change and energy in Scotland, because this can happen and it's real. So let's start with some questions. If there are roving mics, so if you just use a roving mic, stick your hand up. You don't have to say your names. We don't need that information. And for the people watching online, please do send your questions in right now, and we're following that and we'll pick up the questions. So can we start over here?
Hi, Anna Hunter, Sustainable Scotland Network. How do you see the role of local government evolving, Chris, to help create and sustain the transition to a low-carbon, climate-resilient economy?
So the question was about local government, is that right?
Yeah.
So I mean, the closing comment at the end there was was where I would turn. So I mean, let's just trot through some of the things I said there. If we think about energy consumption as the thing that sort of binds this big challenge together, and think about the issues that local government have at their disposal or consider. That's transport, that's the built environment, and it's potentially also where we generate some of that power that we thought about. So I see local government being pretty much the most important element actually in all of this. So mainly it's about having a local plan for all of that. And just go through that again, if we have a local plan for the built environment, making it more energy efficient and better, having better buildings, warmer people inside those buildings, a properly integrated transport plan, and a plan about how we might generate electricity even as part of that plan. What else is there? It's an amazingly kind of powerful thing to think about a kind of well-integrated set of local plans. And I would absolutely love to see local government feel empowered to bring those things together. It may be glib to say it, but having a local plan like that is a prospectus for public investment, but also for private investment. So, it's a very clear statement of what needs to happen in that locale. And one of the areas that I've looked at most when we've been thinking about all of this is Denmark. So Denmark has just that. They have a set of municipalities who each have their own energy plan that looks across all of those things. There is a central agency that brings those things together in Denmark, and that's where the national plans are held. But they are fiercely, local, frankly. That's and those plans differ. So, it's fine for me to say how I think the plan can be rolled out nationally, but I would really like there to see a kind of colourful set of local plans around that, and to have, I suppose, the final part proper engagement by the people who live in those places with those plans, because it's how we move ourselves around, how we live, how we heat ourselves. That's these are some of the most fundamental concerns for people living in Scotland today.
Thank you, Chris. Another question, Katrina.
Electricity and energy generation seems to dominate climate discussions, and no doubt this is important. I notice the really high proportion of emissions that agriculture sector accounts for. How does the Scottish Government plan on reducing agricultural emissions?
Well, that's a fascinatingly and difficult question. So I haven't got the shares, but it's entirely correct to say that agriculture and how we use our land accounts for a large proportion of emissions. So here is one of the areas where I think we have a fundamental challenge, actually. So you can go further, much further actually, in reducing agriculture emissions, and indeed that sector has been doing just that. Kirsty might know the stats. But there comes a point where there are more fundamental questions about how we go about our lives. I don't think that the answer to those questions, I don't think there's a need to answer those questions now, but I do think we should be posing them. So the ultimate aim of 90% or 80%, depending whether we're successful in putting that bill through Parliament, reduction in emissions, just about allows the continuation of the set of agricultural activities that we have in Scotland at the moment, just about, but it would require everything else to be up at full heat. So I think there is a legitimate question, and I don't think I'm the one to answer it, about how best to address that agricultural question. I would, again, go back to the point, I would like this to be a challenge that everyone, including those who work in the agricultural sector, feel that they want to try and address. Kirsty might want to say something about all of this.
I wouldn't talk for agricultural colleagues, except to say that agriculture is incredibly complicated, because you're dealing with natural processes, and I think it's quite right that we focus on the activities that Chris has just gone through. We know that lots of farmers are taking this very seriously and doing what they can in terms of land management. When we think of land management, we also need to look at peatland restoration, which the Scottish Government is committed to, and forestry planting as well, which the Scottish Government is committed to, and many farmers too. So it's a complicated issue. The details in the draft plan in agriculture are there if people want to have a look at them. And of course, when the new plan is published in the spring or early next year, the full details of agriculture will be there. So hopefully that helps. Any more questions? One over here.
It's just another one that's come in on email. It says, we're interested in Chris's thoughts on how Scottish Government's analytical tool to identify carbon in the Scottish economy for the climate change plan could be used or made available to guide local authorities' development of area settlement plans to tackle carbon behaviour and local industry skills. Could LHEES developments being undertaken as part of SEEP2 test this?
What a good question. So yes, absolutely is the short answer. So just a kind of brief trot through all this. So the tool that sits underneath this is a relatively new thing for us. We've been developing it here in the Scottish Government. It's something called TIMES, which stands for something, I don't know what it means, but it's an acronym. But it's a really powerful tool to understand the way in which mainly energy is allocated across the economy. And we've kind of bolted various things onto that to pull together the plan that I talked about earlier. It is a really powerful tool. What's one of the most powerful things about the TIMES model in Scotland is that there are TIMES models right around the world. So there are several other TIMES models. So we draw on kind of peer-reviewed science and the way in which we approach this. That is not to say, however, that it's a kind of fully formed article. So our ambition is that once we've finished using that model for the purposes of finalising the current climate plan, we will then put that out of the organisation to be refined further by well managed packages of improvements externally in the Scottish Government, something that we'll work through over the course of the next year. One of the ways in which that tool could be used is to help with local planning around all of this. We haven't tried to do that yet, but it's something that I'd be quite excited to try and do. I sort of I'm slightly kind of torn between whether it's a good idea or not to have local carbon targets and plans. That's something we could do, and occasionally that's something we ask for. What I would really like to see is a set of tools that inform those local plans that I talked about. And one of the package of tools that we've used, for example, very successfully to date is something called the heat map, which I would encourage you all to think about. This is a kind of thing that we have produced here in the Scottish Government but made publicly available. If you look it up, it's on, you just do a web search for Scottish Government heat map. You'll find a website that takes you to publicly available information that shows you heat use modelled at the level of every individual building in Scotland. So we get data from utility companies and all sorts to build that understanding. It tells you a lot, given that it's more than half of our energy consumption. It tells you a lot about how we use energy generally. And local authorities have available to them more granular detail that allows them to plan around that. So if I had it here, you'd be able to see in this city in Leith right now how all of the buildings around us are consuming heat, or gas mainly. And you'll be able to see even where it's wasteful. And there's a kind of clue to where we need to focus our attention in the future. I'd like to see tools like the heat map used as a basis for an actual spatial map or a spatial plan for all of those energy things that we talked about earlier. So transport, the built environment, energy. If we are using those sorts of tools consistently across the country, then I think we can integrate it. So I would really like to see that. It'd be very exciting. And I think there's a step beyond that to say, well, could we then think about how we allocate carbon to those locales at the same time? That would be wonderful. But there are a number of tools I'd like to see used. And you mentioned in your question what we know as the LHES consultation. That was one of the consultative documents that we put out at the start of the year, which is around local heat and energy efficiency planning. And I think that's been a brilliant thing. And it's basically the kind of blueprint for the things I've been talking about here. So it's about looking at that heat and energy efficiency challenge in each local authority and building a plan around that. And if you follow my golden thread argument, then that's half of the battle. So you've looked at half of the energy consumption challenge. Let's throw into that mix the transport challenge, and we're nearly there. So local plans for those things are a very, very powerful thing, but they need. I would like to see them at least done on a consistent basis so that we can build that kind of national picture from it.
How big a challenge is it, and how do you deal with it? I appreciate you put the barrier for local plans.
So how big is that working?
Yeah.
How big a challenge is it, as well as the local plans that you were speaking about, and how do you deal with it, with competing and maybe even slightly contradictory Scottish Government plans? Particularly I'm thinking about the transport one, where on one hand we want to reduce the carbon emissions whilst at the same time reduce air passenger duty to fly more aeroplanes.
Yep. So listen, I am not advocating carbon as the single objective for the Scottish Government. Kirsty might be, but I'm not. And
I am not.
I'm joking. The beauty, though, is that there's kind of interesting thing here that the government has many objectives, and many of them compete. And this is not a new thing. So, I think one of the kind of fascinating challenges is not about unpicking those bits of competition, but instead understanding how we can better align them so you get multiple benefits. So there will be things that compete with that carbon target, definitely. And definitely the air passenger duty policy does compete with that carbon target. But it's not to say that you can't do it. So the really interesting thing about the Act and the way in which we approach this is that we say, well, that's fine. We accommodate that. It means we have to work harder elsewhere through a different suite of policies, and that's okay. So this is about being grown up about taking decisions and saying that some things are more important than others. So the conventional way of describing some of this is to say that the economy competes with carbon. I don't agree with that. So I think that the real challenge is in aligning your carbon policies with your economic policies. There's a fascinating question about how far you can do that before we start competing with things like our fuel poverty targets. It's best that we are clear about that too. So some of this costs. So who pays is a really interesting question for some of these things. But I'm very clear that the right way to approach this is not to hide from it, but instead to say, well, this policy here we're taking that decision for a different set of purposes, and we'll accommodate that in our climate modelling elsewhere. And the really interesting thing about what we're trying to do, I think, in Scotland is that I think we've only just got our head around the fact that the carbon target is law. So it's a kind of interesting thing. It's not just a Scottish government policy now to reduce carbon in the Scottish economy. It was once. That has been turned into a piece of legislation. So it's the Parliament requiring us to do that. And what's really interesting is that it's taken us nearly 10 years to understand how we unpack that. So now that we understand a bit more, at least, about how that will play out, I think the big challenge is maximising multiple outcomes, including the economic one, whilst addressing those carbon targets. And carbon's particularly good, to use geeky terms for a while, as a system target. So building an understanding of the whole system around carbon gets you to this, and this is my golden thread argument, really good understanding of a whole set of issues, social issues, economic issues, and environmental issues. But the kind of main answer to your question is that we mustn't shy away from taking decisions for other reasons and accommodating them in the way that we view all of this. That's my view anyway.
Thank you. So I think the question there, just... Yeah.
Hi Chris, I just wondered about your thinking on how reliant do you feel that we are to achieve our ambition on the UK government's attitude and similar ambition and some of the levers of policy that they kind of effectively control?
So we are reliant, but reliant, there's a kind of negative connotation to that. So I am expecting and I am hopeful that policy at UK level will be a close match to the things that we would like to see in Scotland. So remember that the UK legislation has the same 80% target as the Scottish legislation. It's not about the legislation, but that implies the same kind of set of issues that I've just talked about. That's a law. So I expect that there will be an underpinning from UK legislation for all the things that we want to do. I, however, think increasingly that we have most of the tools already at our disposal to do this. So yes, for example, you work in transport, so there are a set of transport policies, for example, vehicle excise duty and things that drive mass participation in a set of markets that we will probably need to be there. But we can equally drive a change in our transport sector through a different set of policies here, and I think I increasingly think that we shouldn't rely only on UK policy to deliver some of the things that we previously said needed UK policy. So the other obvious thing is the renewables sector. Actually, the reason that renewables is developed in Scotland is because it's really windy and it's really wet and we have a lot of sea and we have all the good reasons to put renewables here. It is partly because there were a set of subsidies made available over the last 15 years that investment's taking place, but it is mainly about the fact that we have the natural resources in the first place. So actually it falls to us in a world where perhaps those generous support mechanisms won't be there to make sure that the conditions are right for renewables to be developed in the right places in Scotland in the future. And the big one, aside from the transport challenge, which I think does rely on UK policy, the big one where I really feel we can do it without reliance at all actually on UK policy is on energy efficiency generally, and especially energy efficiency in the building stock. We have the tools at our disposal to address that, and it is an unusually good thing for us to be focusing on. So making people warmer in their homes is generally thought to be quite a good policy of government, and we have mostly the tools at our disposal to do that. So yes, it's a carbon target, but it's also a social target. It's about encouraging people to feel more comfortable in their lives, and we can do it. So I like to think that the big policies that we might need will be there, and I tend to think that they'll have to be there if the whole of the UK is to meet its 80% target. But let's not kind of wait for it. Let's get on with it. So the plan that you saw in January when we published it, and the final plan that we'll publish next year, will mainly deal with issues that are at our hand and where we feel we can do things. And I think the most obvious example, Ewan, is the transport package that we announced this year. We didn't wait and we got on with it. So I'm excited about all of that.
Do we have another question over here, Lottie?
There's another one from email. What role could community-owned and run district heating systems have in decarbonising Scotland?
A very big one. So the question of so district heating, for those of you who don't know, is a kind of alternative way of not an alternative way. It's a different way from heating homes and businesses from the one that predominantly we have in Scotland at the moment. So we talked about Denmark earlier. So Denmark has a lot of district heating. Denmark's choice to have district heating, which is essentially pipes laid in the ground with hot water in them and a central source of heat. Denmark's choice was driven by a set of economic issues in the 70s. So they had at least 2 oil crises. They were at one stage 99% reliant on oil, all of which was imported. And a spike in the oil price twice crippled the Danish economy. And they made a decision to remove themselves from that global and unmanageable risk and to build really extensive district heating. It has been an expensive thing for the Danes to do that, but each municipality has a different way of heating itself. It's quite remarkable. So I went and visited. I was very fortunate to go to Denmark and visit some of these district heating networks. Most towns have a central source of heat that was once carbon based, and in many places still is, but can be decarbonised in a way that I'm quite jealous of when I think about that heat challenge. And they have a process of sequentially building more and more pipes in the ground and connecting more and more houses to those pipes. I think we will probably have to do the same thing in Scotland. So there are places where it is the right thing now to do that. And as the requirement to decarbonise heat increases over time, we should more and more be looking at building out those district heating networks. In Scotland, we have some of the best, to use an economist term, use cases for district heating. It requires us to spend money, but it also requires a set of actors to agree that that's where they want to take their heat from. So it is mainly a coordination issue, I think, perhaps naively. And we indeed have a policy of supporting them as much as possible. But it's really exciting that I'm now seeing more and more district heating happening in towns, right, and indeed villages right across Scotland. Every city, I think now more or less has a university in it in Scotland that has a district heating network attached to it. Those big anchor tenants are often the place to kind of start to build out some of that. So I'm not naive to the challenge of, it costs money to do this, but I do think that it has this kind of lasting legacy that is worth it. So I think it's hugely important, and let's see them renewably heated as well while we're at it.
So we've got probably time for maybe 2 more questions. Katrina looks like she's got one from online.
Hi. Is any target to reduce energy consumption per each sector? Setting a target to reduce energy consumption by sector, domestic, non-domestic transport, and committing private sector would be great. What are your comments?
So I'm not sure I agree with that, but there are others who very, very, very firmly do agree, and I'm kind of open to that suggestion. So the reason I think sectoral targets for either energy consumption or carbon reduction are not the best idea is because it removes some of the flexibility that I talked about earlier. So let's talk about the APD policy again. A policy for the purposes of growing the Scottish economy to reduce tax on aviation means that the other sectors have to have steeper falls in carbon. And I'm okay with that because it allows us to be flexible as a government. So we have a suite of policies that flex to whatever demands of the current administration are. That flexibility is reduced but not removed entirely by having those sectoral targets. So I could be convinced that that's the right way to go. But the beauty of looking at this overall system target of carbon is that it gives you the ability to flex between those sectors. But there are others who feel very strongly that this is exactly what we should have, including some very notable people in the Parliament at the moment. What do you think, Kirsty?
I think that's very interesting. I think in the plan, when you look at the carbon envelopes, in a sense, the carbon envelopes for each sector are giving you a proxy allowance. However, things change all the time, whether it's events within or policies within the Scottish Government's control or externally. And this is a very, very rapidly changing world, and the Scottish Government has to be able to flex to its own policies and to the democratic process, but also to external events. So so while we have the carbon envelopes in the plan, we're always going to be having to move between them a bit. Yeah.
The beauty of having sectoral targets like that is clarity. So being clear on how each sector how we anticipate that happening, and having a binding target to do that, I can understand would be meaningful.
We're on 1 minute to 12, but we can take, is there a last burning question that's come in online? Yeah, just speak up.
Okay, so planning legislation currently doesn't embed emissions management enough, aside from building standards and brief reference within strategies and local development plans. When will planning and development management legislation truly reflect these requirements? For example, developers don't have to put in district heating networks, digital infrastructure to the degree that's required, EV points, etc. Would this not be essential to deal with those parts of the pie?
So the quick answer to that question is yes, it would be essential, and the longer answer is that I think we'll get there. But planning, quite rightly, doesn't move at rapid pace. So I mean, the planning bill is a really interesting thing that's currently going through Parliament. My personal target for all of this is the next national planning framework. I think what's interesting is that over the next 6 to 9 months, hopefully we will resolve our strategies for energy and for the climate, and for all the things that I've talked about today. The planning regime will then reflect that. So it's that's the right way around. So that the policy should be clearer. The key thing for us is that we need an integrated approach to all this, which will require a whole suite of policies, and the planning regime, I hope, will reflect the priorities that jump out from the strategy, and they are mainly as I've tried to relate them to you today. Would I like to see planning rules become tougher in those areas? Absolutely. So I mean, that's a discussion that we'll need to have. But it is clear to me that tougher building standards over time, at least ratcheting up over time, plus a set of planning rules and policies that support all of this will be necessary for us to meet the ultimate objective. And planning, interesting, is probably the most talked about thing when I come to speak at a seminar. So there is I think a real appetite out there to understand what it is now that the planning regime will do to reflect all of this. And that's probably one of the great missions that we'll need to set ourselves internally here in the Scottish Government. And of course that's a consultative question as well for all of my planning colleagues. Have we got any planners here? There he is. So he'll fix it.
So I think we're now on 12, and it's always very good to finish on time. Can I just say, first of all, thank you to the people who've watched online. This is our first ever webinar from climate change, and clearly the technology was working, unless the questions have been made up by colleagues.
Entirely planted.
And so thank you very much to our technician at the back, who you probably can't see online, but he's made it all happen. So thank you to him. Thank you, the people in the room, for coming along and managing the questions and being interested. Thank you very much to Chris for his wonderful talk. And just a plea, please use social media. Follow us on ScotGovClimate. The hashtag is #ScotClimateWeek. Do join in the discussion, keep it going. There's been some really great questions asked, and we'd like to continue the dialogue. So thank you very much.
Thank you.